Well, extreme cold has forced NASA to reschedule its next moon mission.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
12 astronauts walked on the moon during the Apollo missions. Every single one of them returned safely to Earth. But after the last mission, humanity never went back. For more than half a century, people have asked the same question. Why? NASA's official explanation has always been simple: funding, changing priorities, and the end of the space race. But that explanation has never satisfied everyone, because money never stopped us from sending probes to the outer planets, building massive space telescopes, or keeping astronauts living aboard a station orbiting Earth. So if it wasn't money, what really made us stop going to the moon? And why did one Apollo astronaut remain silent about it for decades until now? Let's find out. The man who was already there. Something about the moon never sat right with him. For 50 years, Charles Duke stayed quiet because of where he had been and what he had seen before he ever stepped onto the surface. During Apollo 11, Duke sat in mission control as Capcom, the only voice allowed to speak directly to the astronauts. When Neil Armstrong said, "The Eagle has landed," that was not just a line. It meant the lunar module had touched down safely after a descent filled with alarms and fuel running dangerously low. Duke responded, "Roger, tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again." That was not a joke. The entire control room had been holding their breath because the landing was seconds from failing. The lunar module was running out of descent fuel. The fuel needed to slow down and land safely on the moon. Neil Armstrong had less than 30 seconds of that fuel left, and as he approached the surface, he saw the landing area was filled with rocks. If the fuel ran out, he would not have been able to land. The spacecraft would have crashed, or they would have been forced to abort at the last second. Duke's words were pure relief after realizing they had just avoided disaster. Neil took manual control, guided the spacecraft to a safer spot, and landed just in time. Duke's words were pure relief after realizing they had just avoided disaster. That is the level of pressure Duke lived in, and he carried that into everything that came after. Before Apollo 16, he had already trained for the Apollo 13 mission, the mission that almost ended in disaster. An oxygen tank exploded on the way to the moon. The crew lost power, lost heat, and lost normal oxygen supply. At one point, they were close to freezing and suffocating at the same time. The entire mission turned into a fight to bring them back alive using improvised solutions that were never meant to work in space. Duke trained knowing that was a real possibility. He understood that space was not exploration, it was survival. And then there are the parts of his life that people rarely talk about. At one point, Duke's personal life fell apart under the pressure of his career. His marriage was breaking down. He later admitted he had become distant, consumed, and emotionally unavailable. The same focus that made him reliable in space was quietly damaging his life at home. Then came something even darker. After returning from the moon, Duke went through a period of deep inner struggle. He spoke openly years later about feeling empty despite having achieved something almost no human ever will. Imagine walking on another world and still feeling like something is missing. That kind of silence changes a person. So when Apollo 16 launched in April 1972, Charles Duke was not just another astronaut. He was a man who had already seen how close everything could come to collapse. He spent 71 hours on and around the moon, and when he came back, something about him felt different. There have long been quiet rumors that for days after the mission, he barely spoke to anyone. Some claimed he would just sit there staring into space as if still trying to process something he could not explain. Others said he looked very lost and scared, and at times suffered from intense headaches and even bouts of vomiting, as if what he experienced had not fully left him. And then, just as suddenly, he went silent for 50 years, until now. What he says actually happened begins with a mission that looked, on every piece of paper, completely routine. A mission that was meant to be completely routine. Apollo 16 lifted off on April 16, 1972, carrying a crew of 3. John Young served as the mission commander, a seasoned astronaut who had already journeyed to the moon once before on Apollo 10. Ken Mattingly was the command module pilot, tasked with maintaining the spacecraft in lunar orbit while the others made their descent to the surface. And Charles Duke was the lunar module pilot, the man who would stand beside Young on the moon. 3 highly skilled, carefully chosen professionals on what was expected to be one of the most scientifically valuable missions in the entire Apollo program. Their destination was an area known as the Descartes Highlands. Geologists had selected this location with purpose. The highlands were believed to hold some of the oldest rock on the entire moon, material formed during the earliest and most violent period of lunar history billions of years ago, when the solar system was still coming together. Scientists expected to find answers there, ancient, untouched geology that would help fill in important gaps in what we knew about how the moon and ultimately the Earth came to exist. The mission goals were clear and direct. Duke and Young were to set up scientific instruments across the surface to measure moonquakes, solar wind activity, and cosmic radiation. They were to gather rock and soil samples from highland terrain that no earlier mission had ever reached. They were also assigned to drive the lunar rover across tougher and more uneven ground than any previous crew had attempted, testing both the vehicle and their own ability to handle difficult terrain. Young and Duke landed the lunar module called Orion on April 21st. Over the next 3 days, they carried out 3 separate moonwalks, known as EVAs, short for extravehicular activities. The first EVA lasted more than 7 hours. The second went beyond 7 hours as well. The third came in just under 6. Altogether, the 2 men spent over 20 hours working directly on the lunar surface, traveling more than 16 miles across the highlands in the rover and collecting 211 pounds of geological samples from several locations. Everything was being monitored from the ground the entire time. Every word spoken between Duke and Young was recorded. Every reading from their suits, their oxygen levels, their heart rates, their exact positions on the surface was being tracked live by Mission Control in Houston. If anything had gone wrong, the people in that room would have known instantly. And nothing did go wrong. That is the key point to understand. Apollo 16 was operating smoothly. No equipment failures, no medical issues, no unexpected changes from the flight plan. By every measurable standard, this was one of the most flawless missions in the history of the Apollo program. The Descartes Highlands were meant to give humanity a quiet, untouched glimpse into the moon's ancient past. Predictable geology, familiar science, controlled exploration. About 5 hours into their exploration of a flat stretch of terrain called the Cayley Plains, they had already spent hours on the surface and everything was unfolding exactly as planned. And then, on the horizon, something caught Duke's attention that simply should not have been there. The anomalies that appeared before they found it. The moon has no atmosphere whatsoever, not a thin one, not a partial one, none at all. Sunlight striking the lunar surface arrives completely unfiltered, bright, harsh, and perfectly even across everything. Shadows are pitch black because there is no air to scatter light into the darker areas. No color shifts, no softness, no gradients. What you see is exactly what physics says you should see, and nothing more. Duke had been observing exactly that from the moment he stepped outside. The surface was behaving exactly the way every training manual said it should. During the second EVA, as Duke and Young drove the rover deeper into a particular part of the Cayley Plains, Duke noticed that the light had changed. The white sunlight he had been working under for hours had begun to show color. Faint blues and greens were appearing in what should have been a completely colorless environment. There was no equipment failure that could account for it. There was no atmospheric effect because there is no atmosphere. The color had no clear origin. Duke glanced over at Young. Young was seeing it too. They reported it to Houston right away. Houston gave them no explanation and told them to continue with their work. That alone should have stopped everything. It did not. The second anomaly happened in the same area, and this one is even harder to explain. Sound cannot travel on the moon. With no atmosphere, there is no medium for sound waves to move through. The only audio Duke and Young could actually hear came through their radio systems or through direct vibration within their suits and equipment. But in that same stretch of the Cayley Plains, both men began hearing tones through their helmets. Not static, not radio interference, but tones, harmonic sounds that resonated and lingered, almost structured, almost rhythmic, with no source they could identify. They reported this to Houston as well. Once again, no explanation was given. They were told to keep going. The third anomaly was time. Duke described certain moments during the second EVA when his sense of time became unreliable. Tasks that should have taken several minutes felt like they were over in seconds. When they checked their timers, the recorded time was accurate, but what Duke was experiencing internally did not match what the clock was showing. Something in that area was affecting his perception in a way he could not control or explain. The fourth anomaly was the one Duke found most difficult to describe. Throughout their time in that region, both he and Young felt as though they were being watched. Not a vague unease, but a steady, distinct sensation of focused attention directed at them from somewhere they could not locate. Something was aware of them. Duke was a military test pilot who had spent his entire career learning to shut down exactly that kind of psychological distraction. He could not shut this down. Young felt it too. All four of these anomalies, the colored light, the impossible sound, the distorted time, and the sense of being observed, occurred in the same concentrated part of the Cayley Plains, the same area they were still driving through. When Duke looked toward the horizon, he first thought it was a rock formation, a ridge, something the terrain had created at an unusual angle. But as they moved closer, that explanation completely fell apart. The structure, something on the horizon, had the wrong shape. The geometry was too precise. The lunar surface is chaotic, shaped by billions of years of random meteor impacts. Natural formations are uneven, irregular, and organic, but what Duke was looking at had angles, straight edges, sharp lines that simply should not have been there. He pointed it out to Young. Young noticed it instantly. Without any discussion, they veered off their planned route and drove the rover about 200 meters toward it. As they got closer, it did not turn into anything natural. Duke described what they were seeing as a wall or foundation-like structure nearly 100 meters long, made up of large blocks arranged in a way that was clearly intentional. This was not something the moon had formed on its own. It had been placed there. The structure was partially buried. Only the top sections were visible above the surface, meaning what they could see was just the upper portion of something much larger lying underground, hidden from view. The blocks were darker in color and smoother in texture than the surrounding lunar rock. The edges were sharp, the corners defined, and some of the blocks seemed to have been fitted together with clear purpose. Millions of years of meteor impacts had damaged the joints, but the intentional placement was still visible beneath it all. Something had built this. Duke and Young stopped the rover about 50 meters away. They radioed Houston with a complete description of what they were seeing. Then they asked for permission to move closer and begin detailed photography. Houston went silent. The pause stretched on for what felt like several minutes. Duke admits the time distortion they had been experiencing in that area made the actual duration hard to judge. When the reply finally came, the voice on the line was not their usual Capcom. It was someone else, someone more senior. The words were calm and measured. Do not approach the structure any closer. Photograph it from your current position, then move immediately to the assigned sampling site. No explanation, no acknowledgement of what they had just reported. No questions, no excitement. Nothing from a room full of scientists whose entire careers were built on understanding the moon. Just a controlled, prepared instruction to move on. Duke and Young were military pilots. They followed orders. They photographed the structure from where they sat in the rover, turned around, and drove away. But Duke understood exactly what that silence meant, the speed of the redirection, the authority in the voice, the complete lack of surprise. Houston was not hearing this for the first time. They already knew. Whatever Duke and Young were looking at, Mission Control had already decided how to handle it. When Duke returned to Earth and reviewed the mission photography during debriefing, the images of the structure were missing. He was first told they were being held for technical analysis, then he was told there had been issues during film development, then that they had been classified for national security reasons, and finally that they had been lost during an archive reorganization. 4 different explanations, each one contradicting the last. And that contradiction is not random or a sign of poor record keeping. When an organization truly loses something by accident, the explanation stays consistent because the truth does not change. When the explanations keep shifting, it suggests someone is controlling a narrative, adjusting it each time the previous version stops working. 4 versions of what happened to those photographs over 50 years is not confusing. It is the mark of a deliberate cover-up. The photographs have never appeared in any public NASA archive, any research collection, or any declassified Apollo record anywhere in the world. Duke saw them being taken. He reviewed the contact sheets during the initial debriefing, and those images were there. Then they were gone, pulled into classification, and never seen again. Without those images, his account becomes something any official spokesperson can dismiss as the fading memory of an old man. That is exactly what a cover-up requires. Remove the physical evidence, and the witness is left with nothing but his word. But the photographs of the structure were not the only images that vanished. There was something else on that contact sheet, something that had nothing to do with geology, and it is the detail that Duke took the longest to finally say out loud. While Duke and Young were stopped at the rover, studying the structure and waiting for Houston's response, something moved. Not the structure, not a shadow shifting because of the strange light they had been seeing. Something separate, something near the structure moving along its edge. Duke noticed it. He turned to Young. Young was already watching it. Duke described the shape as upright. The proportions were humanoid, meaning it had the general outline of a standing figure, but it was not human. It was taller than any person, and the way it moved felt wrong. Not wrong in a way Duke could easily explain, but wrong in the sense that it moved like something never shaped by Earth's gravity. The motion did not match anything he had been trained to recognize. It was not mechanical. It was not a piece of equipment. It was not debris. It was moving with purpose along the edge of a structure that should not have existed. Duke raised his camera and took a photograph. The shutter clicked. The frame was captured. He is certain about that. He did not hesitate. He did not freeze. He lifted the camera and took the shot. The image was not perfectly clear because the figure was moving and they were observing from about 50 meters away, but the shape was visible in the frame. Upright, distinct against the lunar surface, separate from the structure beside it. Clearly not a rock, not a shadow, not any piece of equipment from the Apollo mission. When Duke returned to Earth and reviewed the debriefing photographs, that image was missing. It had been on the same roll, in the same sequence as the structure photographs. All of it disappeared together into the same classified silence. But Duke is not the only one who saw it. He does not name specific individuals, but he has mentioned in recent interviews that others were present during the initial debriefing review. People who saw the contact sheets before classification, people who confirmed that the image existed. The photograph was there and then it was not. For decades, Duke said nothing about this publicly. The structure he could speak around, he could present it as a geological anomaly, as something needing further study, as something science had not yet explained. That framing gave him some space, but there is no framing available for what he saw moving beside that structure. There is no official language that contains it, no scientific category that makes it easier to report. It exists outside every framework we have, and Duke understood that from the moment he saw it. He has said in recent interviews that this is the detail that took him the longest to speak about, not because he has any doubt about what he saw. He has no doubt. Young saw it too. The photograph existed. His hesitation was never about uncertainty. It was about what saying it means. It was about knowing that the moment he describes a figure moving on the lunar surface beside a buried structure, a large number of people listening will stop taking him seriously. He spent 50 years building a reputation as one of the most reliable and disciplined individuals in the history of space exploration. He knows exactly what this admission costs him. He said it anyway. He saw it. Young saw it. The photograph was taken and later confirmed by others before it was removed from the record entirely. And then, like everything else that happened in that region of the Cayley Plains, it was erased as if it had never happened. Once you understand that, the question of why Apollo ended stops being about politics or funding entirely. It becomes something else. It becomes the only question that matters, and Duke's answer to it is the most unsettling thing he has said. The age, the pattern, and the real reason we never returned. There was one detail from the structure that stayed with Duke more than anything else: the age of the blocks. The moon has no weather in the way Earth does, but its surface is not still. It is constantly struck by micrometeorites exposed to solar radiation and subjected to extreme temperature changes that slowly wear down and texture any material left on its surface. Geologists can read that process like a clock. The longer something has been on the lunar surface, the deeper and more noticeable that weathering becomes. The block showed weathering that went deep, not the kind that builds up over thousands of years, but the kind that takes millions, possibly hundreds of millions. That places the construction of that structure in a time that predates every human civilization ever recorded. It predates our species entirely. It predates the evolutionary chain that eventually led to human beings. Whatever built that structure did so at a time when the most complex life on Earth was still figuring out how to survive. Duke is not the only one suggesting that Apollo discovered more than it revealed. Edgar Mitchell walked on the moon during Apollo 14 and spent his later years openly stating that governments are actively hiding evidence of non-human contact. That was not casual speculation from a retired dreamer. Mitchell held a doctorate from MIT and had spent his career within one of the most classified programs in human history. Al Worden, command module pilot for Apollo 15, went even further. He made public statements indicating that evidence of non-human intelligence in our solar system exists and is being suppressed, and he said it as someone who had held top-level security clearances throughout his NASA career. These were not outsiders. They were individuals who had been trusted with the most sensitive information their government held, and they used their final years to say the official story was incomplete. The pattern is not that every Apollo astronaut witnessed the same things. The pattern is that those who spoke most openly later in life all pointed in the same direction, not toward budget cuts or declining public interest, but toward something that was discovered and then hidden. And we have not returned. Not in 50 years. We have the technology. We have the capability. We have spent billions reaching deeper into space than any Apollo mission ever aimed to go. But the moon, the one place we know how to reach, the one place where something was found, has not had a single human visitor since December 1972. That is not an accident. That is a choice. And the reasoning behind that choice becomes clear once you consider what Duke is describing. Every mission back to the moon risks another discovery, another set of images that must be removed from the record, another crew that comes home knowing something they are not allowed to share. At some point, the simpler solution is to stop going entirely. Let the program fade into history and trust that without new evidence, the questions will slowly stop being asked. That is what Duke believes happened. Not one dramatic act of suppression, but a calculated institutional decision. The program ended because continuing it had become too risky to control. Questions about what was built on the moon, what was standing beside it, and what it means for everything we have ever believed about who we are and where we come from. Charles Duke is 89 years old. He has told you what he saw.